So that's culture. So it's a very profound shock for them to recognize that they're naked. It even makes Adam hide from God. And then they develop the knowledge of good and evil. Well, I think it's because, you see, human beings have this peculiar capacity that no other creature has, which is, I know how I can be hurt. Because I'm aware of my own limitations, painfully aware. And now, because I know how I can be hurt, I know how you can be hurt. And I can take advantage of that. And that's, I think, how evil enters the world. That's what it looks like to me. It's like, I've got this expansion of knowledge. It says in Genesis that gives people another attribute of divinity, knowing the difference between good and evil. It has nothing to do with animals, and it has nothing to do with Adam and Eve prior to having their eyes opened. But the cosmos switches when that self-consciousness manifests itself. And that's when the possibility of evil enters the world. It's something like that. And that's also echoed by the intimate relationship between the snake in the Garden of Eden and Satan, which is, we'll go into, because that's a very strange association. It's like this snake also becomes the adversary of being. And I think that's, I'll jump very quickly into that, but I think that's because, you know, there's the snake that bites you in the jungle, and then there's the snake that lives in your enemy, and then there's the snake that lives in your family if you've banished the enemy to the Netherlands. And then there's the snake that lives in you if you remove yourself from your family. And that snake that's in you, right, that's a psychological phenomena. That's equivalent to transcendent evil itself, the thing that inhabits every single person. That's why there's that association between the snake and Satan. And that's why I think that people have this, it's associated with our knowledge of vulnerability that gives us this constant capacity for evil. I mean, imagine if you're a medieval torturer. You know, I mean, people don't generally imagine that sort of thing, but people were medieval torturers, and they were very good at what they did. And the only way that you can be a torturer is to know what would hurt you, right? And so you exploit your own vulnerability, you exploit the knowledge of your own vulnerability to bring pain into the world. And I don't think that you can lay that precisely at God's feet. Now, people have been arguing about that for a very long time, but my question, the question for me that arose from that is, all right, fine, like tragedy, you can lay that at God's feet. Well, if we didn't bring additional evil into the world, could we tolerate the tragedy of being without becoming corrupt? And I think generally the answer to that is yes, because I've seen people react quite heroically to the arbitrary burdens of their life. But malevolence, man, that lays them low. It lays them low, and it seems to be nothing but a destructive force. And I do believe as well, and I think you see this in the Cain and Abel story, that the root of malevolence is the desire for revenge against God for creation itself. And I mean, I've read terrible things written by terrible people trying to get to the bottom of things, and I mentioned the Columbine killers, for example, and it's clear, all you have to do is go read what they wrote. What they were doing was taking revenge against God. They knew that. It wasn't unconscious. They'd been dwelling on this for months, plotting their revenge. And it was revenge against being itself for the crime of being. So.
Thank you.
Hi, Doctor. You'd said when God saw that it was good, you read that as potentially, well, it might be better than nothing. And the story in Genesis, it's bracketed by days, which aren't necessarily literal days, yom, the original word, you know, but it's also bracketed by, and he saw it was good, you know, at the end of the day. So my question is there something more profoundly happening there between this profundity of speaking into existence, the way, you know, the start is, to this observation, this seeing that it's good, and is God modeling consciousness? Is there a little more there for us to grapple with?
Okay, so more for us to grapple with in what way?
In the sense that we have this insight of speaking things forth, but you'd also commented on consciousness as until something's observed, or until it's seen. So when God sees that creation was good, is there kind of this bracketing between the bringing forth through through the word, through Jesus?
Okay, that's good. I see what you mean. Okay, well, I think what that is that okay, so it's perfectly reasonable from an archetypal and psychological perspective to consider the idea of the word equivalent to the spoken truth. I mean, Christ makes that claim in the New Testament, that he's the truth, right? And embodied. And so then logically you can derive from that the idea that if things are spoken into being through truth, then they're good. And so yeah, I think that association exists. And I think that's, well, I also think that's in some sense the deepest claim of faith. I believe that because I think you have to make a decision in your life, as far as I can tell, and I think Kierkegaard knew this more clearly than anyone else I've ever read, and that is that if being is good, then an honest relationship with being also has to be good. And then if you have an honest relationship with being, then you're going to speak the truth. And then I think what you have to decide is that if you speak the truth, then what happens is good, regardless of what happens. And that's the rub of faith, and I think that's something that Kierkegaard wrestled with, you know. And that, I mean, I'm trying to think if I can provide an example about that, and easily and quickly. Well, I guess it's partly because you can live your life two ways. You can use your language to manipulate. You can use your language as a tool to get what you want. But the problem with that is that assumes that you know what you want and that you're right. And that's a problem because there's lots of things you don't know. And if you get what you want, you may find A, that you didn't really want it, and B, that you're not the person that started the journey towards that. That happens a lot to people, especially when they use their language in a manipulative way. And so the alternative seems to be, and I think this is one of the lessons, for example, that's laid out in the movie Pinocchio, which happens to be a kind of archetypal favorite of mine, is that part of the act of faith, let's say, and I wouldn't say Christian faith necessarily, I would say faith in being itself is the decision. It's like the decision that God is good. The decision is, there's no better way to bring better being into being than to speak the truth. And I do think that's echoed. I think that's a very wise observation. I think that's echoed in that first story. First of all, the act of speech, and second, the observation that the consequence was good. So yeah.
Thank you.
Good morning, Citizen Peterson. First, I have a bunch of questions and I want to have them answered immediately. Like, you have a post on Quora in which you encourage all children to incur skateboarding injuries. but also stated in this post, you wrote that, do not try to rescue someone who does not want to be rescued, and be very careful about rescuing someone who does. And can you reconcile this with what you stated about transcendent morality and the heroic impulse that I guess men are supposed to be born with?
Okay. So, well, the skateboarding question is, I have a book coming out in 2018 called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And one of the chapters in there is from that Quora posting, and it's called Don't Bother Children When They're Skateboarding. And it's sort of associated with what I had said earlier about parkour, for example, is that, you know, kids need to go out and push themselves against danger, because that's what life is pushing yourself against danger. And when you see kids doing things that are dangerous but spectacular, then you kind of have a moral obligation to back the hell off and let them experiment with their own mortality, because you can't keep them safe. The best thing you can do is make them able and courageous. And I would say that that's a more difficult lesson, generally speaking, for mothers to learn than for fathers to learn, and that was Freud's fundamental observation, but it's absolutely crucial. And so I've seen kids do, I mean, you know, you can obviously be a fool on a skateboard, although the distinction between being a fool and developing yourself is not as clear as people might like to imagine. And when kids are out there with no helmet and doing dangerous things, it's like there's a part of me that, of course, is very worried about it, but there's another part of me that admires it very much, because they're practicing what they need to practice in order to cope with the world. Okay, so there's that. Now, the other one was rescuing people. Yeah. Well, I got this partly from Carl Rogers, you know, because Rogers he's a clinician, a very famous clinician, and he was a Christian missionary to begin with, but he didn't end up that way. But he was very interested in the utility of listening as a means of redemption, essentially. And listening, by the way, is if you have someone that you know that has a problem, the best thing you can often do is listen to them if they're actually trying to communicate, because people configure themselves through speech. And most people can't think, and I don't mean that in a mean way. I mean the way they think is by talking, and they can't talk unless they have someone to talk to. And it's partly because they're bouncing the idea off them and seeing if it makes sense and seeing how the person responds. So listening is a great thing. But Rogers was also interested in the preconditions for having a redemptive relationship, and that could be a therapeutic relationship or an intimate relationship. And one of the things he claimed was that unless the person was aiming upward, there was nothing you could do about it. And that seemed to be associated with this idea of that initial choice, say, between good and evil. See, once someone comes to therapy, they've already done something. They've already said, I have a problem, conceivably I could fix it, and I need to do something about it. And then, so half the work is already done by the time they show up, because they've already said, well, things aren't as good as they could be, and I could do something about it. The question is, can you do anything about someone who isn't at that state? And my observation, and this is Roger's observation as well, is that you can't. I think you can serve by example, but until the person has decided on their own that they're wrong, and that's why they're suffering, that there's something wrong about what they're doing, and that they want to fix it, I think that even trying to hammer against that often makes it worse.